Hello, theory students. This is just a quick video to refresh your memories about the Group 2 reading. And the Group 2 reading, of course, I'm referring to week 15, where we had readings about contexts, considering different kinds of bilingualism and different contexts of bilingualism that show different results, right? So Group 2, the reading was about additive bilingualism. So once again, additive bilingualism simply means that when you have a fully developed L1, you kind of add another language to that, and it doesn't detract from your L1. So many cases of bilingualism are just that, particularly adults acquiring another language. It's an additive situation. The example that I gave in class was the languages that I know I began studying as a teenager, and I've been consistently in a context where I can use my first language. I'm not going to lose it, but there are cases of the opposite, which I'll talk about in a moment. The opposite, of course, being subtractive bilingualism. And when we talk about subtractive bilingualism, that simply means that the process of learning or acquiring that second language has a detrimental effect on the first language. So take, for example, a child who is separated from speakers of his first language and living in a context with only the new second language. Well, over time, that child is likely to lose that first language. And I've certainly met people like this in my life. Another case of subtractive bilingualism happens in the case of colonialism. So, in the history of the world, there have been colonizing powers that went to new areas that are already occupied by people. And of course, the colonizers bring their language, and whether it's English or French or Portuguese, in the case of the Western Hemisphere, or Spanish, of course, or it's other cases of Asian languages spreading to different areas. What happens is that local people were encountered and they were enculturated in certain ways, forced to learn the language of the colonizers and the culture of the colonizers and the religion of the colonizers. So such is the history of the world. That would be a case of subtractive bilingualism because, of course, the logic of colonialism is that, there's primitive people who need the support of the colonizers to speak the better language and to understand the better culture, in quotes, and to worship a better God, right? So those are cases of subtractive bilingualism as well. BICS and CALP, of course, are a major part of this reading. BICS, you'll remember, is Basic Interpersonal Communication System. That's kind of a fancy way of saying playground talk, right? So playground language is the kind of language that children are likely to use with their friends, with their peers, with their classmates, in an informal context, out on the playground or on the streets, near their houses, whatever. It's very context dependent, as we say, because it's not just text on its own or language on its own. It's language that's that's embedded in a kind of context of games and children's activities, and there's typically physical objects like balls and toys or whatever it is, so they can kind of pick up the little phrases like throw the ball, let's play tag, you're it, whatever the games are, or playing with different toys, video games, whatever it is. It's kind of to casually talk with friends. Fairly easy for children to pick up. It takes a year or 2 years to master BICS under appropriate circumstances. So BICS is half of one side of the coin, we'll say, when it comes to children's language. And the other side of the coin is CALP. And CALP is cognitive academic language proficiency, which is language for school. Okay, so this is the language that students need to succeed in the classroom. So it requires that the learner relies on linguistic cues primarily. So if you think back to your days in school, you have a lot of text to read and understand. You have specific things that you're learning, and there's not a whole lot of context outside of the text to help you understand. It takes 5 to 7 years to master CALP, and as I mentioned in class, the student's level of CALP can be missed by the teacher simply because their BICS level is so high. So in other words, a child could seem quite fluent to the teacher in the classroom, perhaps expressing himself pretty clearly and talking to the teacher and talking to friends and sounding very fluent. But when it comes to that classroom language and that context-independent text on paper, or the listening comprehension, or the reading comprehension, or what they're doing for homework, they could have quite low understanding of CALP and mastery of CALP. So that's a key point about BICS and CALP. You know, we need to be aware that some students are fluent, but they may be lacking in the classroom. It's BICS, but not CALP. And finally, what do we need to succeed in BICS and CALP? What do our learners need? Well, they need a certain aptitude, which is, they need to have a certain ability for language, but also we know that certain personality types are going to do well with BICS and CALP. As we talked about in class, one of those, you feel free to guess at home, one of those was students who are outgoing and social are going to be more likely to be experimenting with language, more likely to be using language with speakers of that language and not be afraid to talk to people in that language, simply because, they're that kind of person, probably an L1 as well. So outgoing and social people are always going to have a kind of advantage when it comes to learning language. When it comes to the communicating with people, perhaps that means, more of a casual thing, as was mentioned in class today. Maybe that's more BICS related, right? Because it's the basic interpersonal communication stuff. And so maybe that's more appropriate for that. Which brings us to the other personality type. If you're shy but have a high cognitive ability and pay attention to detail, for example, that's great for a language learner as well. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that this is just for CALP, but it will certainly help with CALP, because what are you doing as a shy person with a high cognitive ability who's paying attention? You might pay attention to the academic stuff that you're learning in the classroom, and that'll help you to develop. But also, let's not forget that if you pay attention to detail, we also have this concept of noticing in second language studies. So a student who's out there noticing things might be paying attention even when people are speaking casually to them on the street, in the playground. They could pay attention to things, they could notice that, they could pick it up, and maybe after crash in silent period, maybe they come out and speak, right? Something like this. The other message here I didn't mention in class is, let this be a lesson to you as a language teacher. That is, don't punish the introverts. Don't punish the shy ones. In other words, just because one of your students is maybe not a social butterfly, maybe not friendly with everybody, maybe they're a little bit quiet, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're a bad language learner, right? They could be just kind of taking it all in. Comprehensible input. Remember what Krashen said, that lots of comprehensible input is all it takes to one day go through a silent period and come out the other side of it and be a proficient speaker or a developing speaker in the way that you were when you acquired your first language. So that could be happening, particularly if they have this high cognitive ability and keen attention. Now, why is attention important? Well, we also know in second language studies of this idea of noticing. What is attention but noticing key features of language? And just because they're not repeating and trying things out and talking to everybody doesn't mean that they're not noticing the language. And one day, they're likely to produce. And when they do, you'll be amazed at what they can do, because you gave them time and you didn't give up on them, and they were noticing and clocking everything that was being said. And remember the TED Talk that we watched. The younger the child, the more likely they are. They're kind of taking statistics of that language around them. Of course, that was about babies, but in a sense, don't children pay attention in a similar way? So thank you for watching, and I hope this part of the reading is clear. I look forward to seeing you in the classroom next week. Bye, everybody.